Nobody, no man and no woman, is precisely what they think they are. Love is where you find it. And you don't know where it will carry you.
There's a prejudice that at one time was against homosexuals.
At one time.
Yeah.
Love has never been a popular movement. And no one's ever wanted really to be free. The world is held together, really it is held together, by the love and the passion of very few people.
If all the homosexuals were to leave their jobs simultaneously, the economy of the country would be thrown into something like chaos.
Let me tell you a story. On August 2nd, 1924, James Arthur Jones was born in Harlem, New York. He never knew his birth father, but his mother would remarry soon after his birth, and the man we would come to know eventually as James Baldwin grew up having a tumultuous and difficult relationship with his stepfather, Pastor David Baldwin. Hoping to gain his approval, James spent much of his teenage years attempting to follow in his stepfather's pious path. James Baldwin grew into a legend, a prominent figure of the civil rights movement, a contemporary of Medgar Evers, MLK, and Maya Angelou. His works, Notes of a Native Son, The Fire Next Time, and Go Tell It on the Mountain, to this day stand as intense emotional and philosophical works with damning analysis of American racism and culture, as well as meditations on black existentialism. However, when he left America for Paris in 1948 with $40 in his pocket in hope of encountering a less racist and oppressive environment, these works did not yet exist. Baldwin got his start writing essays and short publications for newspapers, zines, and anthologies. It wasn't until 1953 that he would go on to publish Go Tell It on the Mountain, his first novel. 2 years later saw him publishing Notes of a Native Son, but it wasn't until 1956 that Giovanni's Room, one of my personal favorite of his works, would be published. The novel is intensely emotional and homoerotic. Baldwin himself around the time of publishing was recovering from a particularly intense romantic tryst with a musician named Arnold, which led to his second attempt on his own life. His feelings of loneliness, rejection, and frustration with his own queerness are incredibly apparent in the story, and its central character, David. Baldwin's romantic life was constantly filled with turmoil. As a 22-year-old, he shared an intimate relationship with Eugene Worth, a boy in his neighborhood. Eugene admitted openly to Baldwin that he was in love with him, and they never consummated a relationship. Sadly, he took his own life. Baldwin's struggles with love are laid bare in Giovanni's Room. Like all of his novels, there is an autobiographical element to aspects of the story. He allows multiple characters to embody aspects of his personality as he explores queerness, queer love, and the question of facing one's self, desires, and place in society. But the book isn't merely about the pain of gay love. To quote Baldwin directly,
Giovanni's Room is not really about homosexuality. Go Tell It on the Mountain, for example, is not about a church, and Giovanni is not really about homosexuality. It's about what happens to you if you're afraid to love anybody, which is much more interesting than the question of homosexuality.
The film Moonlight, directed by Barry Jenkins, is based on an unpublished play by Terrell Alvin McCraney. Both the play and the film are deeply entrenched in Baldwin-esque meditations on love, intimacy, society, and queerness. The story is, like Baldwin's work Go Tell It on the Mountain, and to a lesser extent Giovanni's Room, a Bildungsroman, which is a fancy word for a coming-of-age story. Unlike Giovanni's Room, however, Moonlight centers exclusively black characters. The main character, Chiron, is presented in 3 separate stages of his life, 3 different personas as he discovers his queerness, his way of moving through a violently patriarchal world, and his finally deconstructing that image, as well as the moments of cracks in between. The play it was based on was never actually published or performed in any formal sense. According to the author, it wasn't really meant to be in the first place. Structurally, it's quite different from Giovanni's Room.
The play, In Moonlight Black Boys Look Blue, doesn't exist because it was never a play form. I never tried to produce or publish it because it wasn't meant for that. It's written in a very visual language. It was never written down like a play. As my friend described it when he first read it, there's no event. And for a play to happen, you need an event. The cherry orchard happens because the cherry orchard's getting sold. Or the seagull happens because someone kills the seagull and they kind of go crazy. As you can tell from the film, that strong plot-driven narrative is never a part of it.
In spite of their differences in style and presentation, both stories explore the same themes. For one, both main characters, Chiron and David, grow up in single-parent homes to neglectful parents. Though for David it's his father, for Chiron it's his mother. In a way, they are the same story told with different outcomes. Key moments of self-discovery, self-rejection, and queerness mirror each other and both unite the central characters, Chiron and David, and separate them from each other. Additionally, they are stories about heterotemporality, a subject we'll discuss and explain more later. The presence of time both as a literal force on the world around the characters and a social conception of how life should go and be is the central antagonism of both stories, as is the conflict between those who live as themselves and those who conform to heterosexual society, and the internal struggles of those forced to make such decisions. I want to dissect how the film Moonlight and the book Giovanni's Room both deal in and answer complex questions on love and masculinity, specifically what it means to love and express oneself in a way not typical or accepted by society. So without further ado, my name is Anansi, thank you for watching this video, and let me tell you a story. As mentioned before, these stories are structurally very different, mediums aside. Giovanni's Room begins at the end of its story. Our protagonist David explains somewhat vaguely the situation that he's in, and how his lies, affairs, and various nature have led him here. His fiancée Hella is en route back to America without him. His lover Giovanni is to be put to death. It is after this introduction that we receive the rest of the story in the form of a confessional. David meets Giovanni while vacationing in France away from home, attempting to hide from his own queerness by fleeing to another country. His fiancée and the woman he supposedly loves is in Spain on her own vacation, and David cannot help his infatuation with Giovanni in her absence. Over the course of the story, the two fall into tumultuous love, which turns sour as they live together for weeks in Giovanni's titular room. David's two-mindedness about his own sexuality and his feelings for Giovanni drive the two apart as Hella returns to David's side, herself caught into the whirlwind of his inability to accept himself and her own desire to be with him to quiet her fears of not being a woman. David in this story exists in a hub of queer activity, but the whole of it is penetrated by a quiet desperation. These spaces are to queer people what a life raft to a shipwreck survivor is in a storm, and David is not immune to the waves. Moonlight starts with Chiron as a boy, nicknamed Little. We follow Little as he finds safety and support in Juan, an older black man who becomes his father figure. Juan and his girlfriend Teresa provide Little with a safe space away from homophobic bullies and his abusive, drug-addicted mother. In the next chapter of the film, we see Chiron as a teenager, only now learning to have a voice for himself and still struggling without his mother. We watch as Chiron experiences queer love for the first time, as well as anti-queer hate, and the cult of performance and violence that is masculinity, where every man plays chicken with his humanity at stake. The third chapter, Black, observes Chiron as he unpacks and heals the persona his experiences with homophobia, drug dealing, and juvenile detention have worked together to build. In Moonlight, Chiron struggles in isolation. There are almost no safe queer spaces for him to inhabit, and his one source of safety is taken from him. Moonlight and Giovanni's Room are both stories about a man versus himself versus society, meaning that both stories are about someone facing and battling their own internal desires and feelings, but they are only made to do so because of the society around them. Chiron's queerness is first brought up and noticed by the people in his community who revile him for it. Before he's even really felt much in terms of who he experiences love and attraction to, he's already been noticed, alienated, and labeled. In the beginning of the film, he's being chased by other young boys who call him a faggot and seek to harm him. This is not lost on Juan either, who takes Chiron under his wing because of this abuse and its source. Juan's goal is to teach Chiron how to define himself on his own terms, and impart on him the confidence to defend himself. Him floating on the ocean is Juan teaching him to live unmoored from a world that won't accept and respect him, to both float under his own power and trust those who love him to hold him when he can't. The parable about black boys turning blue in Moonlight has multiple meanings. On one hand, it's about blackness, and about blackness being more under the surface than just what others define us as, about our inner beauty that can only be revealed in the right light at the right time. But on the other hand, it's about self-definition. That which others see in you does not have to define you. You have to define yourself. In Moonlight, black boys look blue, but that doesn't mean blue is Juan's name. Whatever shame or sin others see in Chiron does not have to define him, doesn't have to be called forth by that name. Chiron must give name to himself and his feelings on his own terms. But the problem is that Chiron doesn't actually learn how to define himself for himself. Chiron isn't just learning to define himself, but to perform confidence, to perform masculinity, so as to avoid being acknowledged and targeted. He's learning to hide. That's why in his teenage era he struggles so deeply to actually project the masculine confidence he's attempting to embody. When he tells other boys to leave him alone, he can barely keep eye contact. His performance is not sufficient to keep him safe. For David and Giovanni's room, it is equally fraught. While Moonlight is about the violence one faces and suffers as a queer person coming up in a patriarchal and racist society, and how one manages to define themselves in the midst of it, Giovanni's room is about the other side. David is less struggling to find acceptance from the rest of society, and more struggling to even face himself. Giovanni's room is about the road he walks, paved with the bodies of those his inability to accept and love himself has harmed. It's a story about the way we lie to ourselves. David walks through multiple queer accepting environments that would have likely been a godsend for someone like Chiron. Yet all he can do is look at everyone there with disdain meant for himself. Early in the book, he tells the story of a young man named Joey, who he had an intimate and eventually sexual friendship with. The morning after the two consummate their relationship, David is distraught. He cannot handle having to think about what this means as a man, about what it makes him. I awoke while Joey was still sleeping, curled like a baby on his side toward me. He looked like a baby, his mouth half open, his cheek flushed, his curly hair darkening the pillow and half hiding his damp round forehead, and his long eyelashes glinting slightly in the summer sun. Joey's body was brown, was sweaty, the most beautiful creation I've ever seen till then. I would have touched him to wake him up, but something stopped me. I was suddenly afraid. Perhaps it was because he looked so innocent lying there with such perfect trust. Perhaps it was because he was so much smaller than me. My own body suddenly seemed gross and crushing, and the desire which was rising in me seemed monstrous. But above all, I was suddenly afraid. It was borne in on me, but Joey is a boy. I saw suddenly the power in his thighs, in his arms, and in his loosely curled fists. The power and the promise and the mystery of that body made me suddenly afraid. That body suddenly seemed the black opening of a cavern in which I would be tortured until madness came, in which I would lose my manhood. Precisely, I wanted to know the mystery and feel the power and have that promise fulfilled through me. The sweat on my back grew cold. I was ashamed. The very bed in its sweet disorder testified to vileness. I wondered what Joey's mother would say when she saw the sheets. Then I thought of my father, who had no one in the world but me, my mother having died when I was little. A cavern opened in my mind, black and full of rumor, suggestion of half-hearted, half-forgotten, half-understood stories, full of dirty words. I thought I saw my future in that cavern. I was afraid. I could have cried for shame and terror, cried for not understanding how this could have happened to me, how this could have happened in me, and I made my decision. I got out of bed and took a shower and was dressed and had breakfast ready when Joey woke up. I did not tell him my decision, that would have broken my will. I did not wait to have breakfast with him, but only drank some coffee and made an excuse to go home. I knew the excuse did not fool Joey, but he did not know how to protest or insist. He did not know that this was all he needed to have done. When I finally did see him, more or less by accident near the end of the summer, I made up a long and totally untrue story about a girl I was going along with. And when school began again, I picked up with a rougher, older crowd and was very nasty to Joey, and the sadder this made him, the nastier I became. He moved away at last, out of the neighborhood, away from our school, and I never saw him again. I began, perhaps, to be lonely that summer, and began that summer the flight which has brought me to this darkening window. David suppresses this memory and lies to Giovanni about it. The fear presented to him in this scene is his central battle. He runs away from America to escape it and fails. David fundamentally cannot handle the implications of his love for Joey. On multiple levels, this encounter is destroying him. In a heterotemporal sense, meaning dealing with one's perception of time and milestones in life, as a queer person. This encounter destroys the entire track of David's life. Later in the book, he says it more explicitly to Giovanni, screaming,
"What kind of life can two men have together anyway? All this love you talk about. Isn't it just that you want to be made to feel strong? You want to go out and be the laborer and bring the money, and you want me to stay here and wash the dishes and cook the food and clean this miserable closet of a room and kiss you when you come in through that door and lie with you at night and be your little girl. That's what you want. That's what you mean, and that's all you mean when you say you love me. You say I want to kill you. What do you think you've been doing to me?"
I first realized myself that I was bisexual when I was 13. I even managed to find a few friends who were accepting and be honest with them about my feelings, but this didn't last long. I soon found myself on the wrong end of several occasions of homophobic violence, that being only the most extreme expression of the homophobia I was facing daily. I'm not going to get far into it, but my experiences with homophobia, both as a force of violence and a force of social alienation, which is really a more passive kind of murder, made me too afraid to be out anymore. I honest to God forgot for like 3 years that I ever came out at all. The first time, I think, a lot of the shame that comes with it was easy for me to dismiss, or I didn't really feel it. The violence I'd faced and the deeply religious environment I found myself entrenched in made me repress my sexuality deeply afterward. When it came back, the second realization was not as gentle as the first. One of the things I felt was shame. I knew my parents' expectation was that I would participate in our religious community in some capacity, and I knew in multiple ways that I was now bound to fail to fulfill those expectations. When I finally accepted it for real, it felt like the entire life I was living and building was falling apart around me. The moment that the two fall in love, David is distraught because he feels that his gender, his ability to be a man, is destroyed. If he tries to live his life as a gay man with Joey, it will derail the course of their entire lives. Even outside of the ways oppression and homophobia factor in, they cannot have kids in the traditional sense that their families expect. They cannot, at least in the eyes of the society around them and thus David, fulfill the role that a son is supposed to fulfill. David's gender, in the sense of his ability to perform manhood, and his conception of himself as a man, have both been utterly destroyed. Joey is only the first victim of David's lifetime of trying to outrun the shockwave of that destruction. Moonlight actually has a moment that almost, at least emotionally, perfectly mirrors this. Chiron and his childhood friend Kevin share a romantic sexual moment on the beach. Much like in Giovanni's room, the moment is tense with fear, yet once the two are comfortable, it's tender and sweet. There's a genuine love blossoming. This is where the stories differ in perspective. Kevin does something similar to what David does. The next day, one of Chiron's bullies convinces Kevin to force Chiron into a game called Knockdown, Stay Down, which is basically just a violent hazing ritual where the victim is punched repeatedly until they don't get up again. Kevin only allows himself to be forced to do this to someone he just had a romantic encounter with, solely to save his own skin. If he says no, he'll be read as gay like Chiron is and become a victim to the same violence. Kevin's entire persona is that he's a hypersexual straight man. When we first see his teenage self, he's bragging to Chiron about a sexual encounter with a girl that likely never happened. Him clocking that Chiron is performing straightness like him is why they had that romance in the first place. There was a note of safety in that recognition that Kevin willingly destroys the moment it threatened his ability to hide himself. During this game, both are forced by implicit violence to perform. If Kevin doesn't hit him, it means that he too is affected, and that he too is deserving of the same homophobic abuse that Chiron faces. Chiron, however, cannot stay down. This fight has nothing to do with him proving or disproving his sexuality, but being able to stand for himself and stand against the violence the world puts on him. In a way, it's a triumph. He refuses to hit Kevin back, refuses to participate in the violence against someone he cares for. He can't fight back, so all he can do is stand and hold his head up defiantly. When he finally does bash back against the violence of the patriarchal world around him, he doesn't strike at Kevin. He strikes back at the source, definitively. The reaction of a homophobic world around him prevents this moment from being the salvation and revelation Chiron needs. He's jailed, while the boys who beat him bloody the day before go off scot-free.
If you were a man, there'll be 4 other knuckleheads sitting right next to you.
Thus, his next persona in the next phase is a reaction to this. The color black in the story often seems to represent a dark, absolute and at times violent masculinity. Chiron's last phase, named Black, a nickname given to him by Kevin, exists to make Chiron seem as hyper-masculine as possible. His workouts, the gun he carries, even the gold teeth he wears like fangs, the way he carries himself coldly, is meant to be a definitive shell to protect himself from anyone seeing what his bully saw in him before, what his mother saw. Chiron doesn't allow himself to seem anything other than a straight hypermasculine platonic ideal of a man. He doesn't do this to gain love or admiration, but simply to be left alone. And this is often the end goal of masculinity. It is a performance one takes up in the hopes that it will make others leave you alone. I think that's part of the reason why men have such a hard time forming close friendships, because so much of masculinity exists not to cultivate relationships, but to prevent you from having to deal with that struggle in the first place, to prevent you from having to deal with violence from other men. There is no room for vulnerability or any form of non-normative existence. You cannot be masculine and open at the same time, because masculinity requires you to be an unemotional, unbothered shell, or a hypersexual rage machine. When Chiron leaves Miami, he has no one he can safely leave his shell around. He immerses himself in a drug world that cannot allow it. He finds various methods to numb himself. He bars himself from his mother emotionally. The final act of the movie is about the slow disillusion of this persona as he and his mother, and he and Kevin, make amends. It is, in a sense, him doing what David cannot in Giovanni's room, slowly reconciling his queerness, his emotions, and his masculinity as things that need not be in conflict. Chiron is slowly gaining the ability to be himself, to be vulnerable and open, and to love. His final persona existed to make him into the person others pressured him to be, that society pressured him to be as a black man. And now he's opening himself up to expressing who he desires to be. I cannot help but wonder as I watch how much the presence of queer-accepting spaces for Chiron could have helped him, could have given him a place to express rather than hide his feelings. For David, however, they do nothing. David spends most of the book inhabiting queer spaces, a bar owned by his friend Gayame, who he finds disgusting, and populated by queer men and women alike, including cross-dressers and trans people, whom David is especially disgusted by. Throughout the story, he reviles any expression of femininity coming from a man. He despises men who he sees as fairies, and all of this is very clearly a reflection of his own self-hatred. Even the titular room owned by Giovanni is not safe from his ire. The more time he spends there sleeping with Giovanni, loving him, building a life with him, the more he wants to leave, the more he resents Giovanni. David's answer to these feelings is to give in to compulsory heterosexuality through his fiancée Hella. Compulsory heterosexuality is a tendency for someone who is queer in some way to engage in heterosexual relationships or encounters in order to hide or deny their queerness, or merely as an unconscious response to societal pressure to be straight. The author who came up with the term, Adrienne Rich, was talking specifically about the lesbian experience in her essay where she discusses it. She discusses the structures of society that covertly and overtly suppress women's sexuality toward each other. Her analysis is certainly applicable to all queer relationships, though. Many, if not all of us, experience heterosexuality, masculinity, and femininity as pressures enforced by violence and social domination.
The assumption that most women are innately heterosexual stands as a theoretical and political stumbling block for feminism. It remains a tenable assumption partly because lesbian existence has been written out of history or cataloged under disease, partly because it has been treated as exceptional rather than intrinsic, partly because to acknowledge that for women, heterosexuality may not be a preference at all, but something that has to be imposed, managed, organized, propagandized, and maintained by force is an immense step to take if you consider yourself freely and innately heterosexual. Yet the failure to examine heterosexuality as an institution is like failing to admit that the economic system called capitalism or the caste system of racism is maintained by a variety of forces, including both physical violence and false consciousness. To take the step of questioning heterosexuality as a preference or choice for women, and to do the intellectual and emotional work that follows, will call for a special quality of courage in heterosexually identified feminists. But I think the rewards will be great. A freeing up of thinking, the exploring of new paths, the shattering of another great silence, new clarity in personal relationships. Adrienne Rich.
Taking her points and applying them to male characters, Chiron's encounter with Kevin earlier is a prime example where both boys must violently affirm their masculinity or face further marginalization. I would posit that masculinity is solely enforced on men and introduced to them through implicit or explicit violence. I cannot think of a time in my life where my masculine tendencies and behaviors were not influenced by the fear of violence that would occur if I failed to perform them. One of my earliest memories as a child is crying because my older sibling painted my nails, and I was afraid that my parents would be angry at me for doing something that was for girls. The performance of masculinity was, at best, based on entirely arbitrary, almost ridiculous metrics, such as what side you button your shirt up on, or what direction you wear your belt, or how you check your nails, to more violent and restrictive regulations, who you can love, how you can dress, the way you speak, how physically strong or imposing you are. Gender is a performance, and the audience pointing a gun at the stage is the only reason we're all still dancing. The constricting nature of masculinity, of cisgender heterosexuality, drives all of us insane, drives all of us to self-denial that presents itself in other ways, or bursts through cracks like blood through gauze. James Baldwin's style of writing in all of his works is semi-autobiographical, even when it's fiction, and Giovanni's Room is no exception. Aside from Giovanni himself being inspired by a bartender who Baldwin knew and saw guillotined in Paris, the story's meditations on heterosexuality, desire, shame, and self-deception are based on Baldwin's own experiences with men as a young adult. He often would have encounters where the same heterosexual men who abused, ridiculed, and caused violence to him sought him sexually and talked openly about their desires.
But if I was paralyzed by guilt and terror, I cannot be judged or judge myself too harshly, for I remember the faces of the men. These men, so far from being or resembling looked and sounded like vigilantes who banded together on weekends to beat up. And I was around long enough, suffered enough, and learned enough to be forced to realize this was very often true. I might not have learned this if I had been a white boy, but sometimes a white man will tell a black boy anything, everything, weeping briny tears. He knows that the black boy can never betray him, for no one will believe his testimony. These men looked like cops, football players, soldiers, sailors, marines, or bank presidents, admin, boxers, construction workers. They had wives, mistresses, and children. I sometimes saw them in other settings, in, as it were, the daytime. Sometimes they spoke to me, sometimes not, for English has many days and styles. Sometimes, eventually, inevitably, I would find myself in bed with one of these men, a despairing and dreadful conjunction, since their need was as relentless as quicksand and as impersonal, in sexual rumor concerning blacks that preceded me. As for sexual roles, these were created by the imagination and limited only by one's stamina. At bottom, what I had learned was that the male desire for male roams everywhere, avid, desperate, unimaginably lonely, culminating often in drugs, piety, madness, or death. It was also dreadfully like watching myself at the end of a long, slow-moving line. Soon I would be next. All this was very frightening. It was lonely and impersonal and demeaning. I could not believe, after all I was only 19, that I could have been driven to the lonesome place where these men and I met each other so soon, to stay.
This phenomena is still around today. A lot of young queer men or trans people have the experience of being used by otherwise quote-unquote straight men or DL men who aren't out as vehicles for their sexual gratification. Queer people often exist as a safe space of expression for straight people, especially men, for better and for worse, usually worse. This situation is a space where violence is incredibly common, particularly for trans women. In 2023, 320 transgender people were murdered. 32 of these murders were in the US. Both worldwide and in the US, the majority were black and brown trans women. Black women in particular. 36% of the known murderers of these women were intimate partners or family. Trans people are 1.7% more likely to face intimate partner violence than cis people. And among trans people of various orientations, the likelihood to be victimized by intimate partner violence is the same. The source of much of this violence is men who want to keep their relations with trans women secret. Shame or embarrassment from being caught sleeping with or dating trans women, and a desire to aggressively reassert their straightness result in violence and even murder for trans people.
Men need to come out of the shadows. I've hung out with professional athletes, actors, and rappers. I party with boys in the neighborhoods and with celebrities. I've watched men from all walks of life date trans women in secret and in stealth. I've had family members, friends, colleagues who have been with, have dated, or are attracted to trans women. Men need to stand up and stop lying. Men live in fear. Cis men are not in danger because we are attracted to or date trans women. Our fear, however, is killing trans women.
David, like many of these men, seeks secret places and spaces to enact his sexuality. Like so many others, he uses queer bodies as a receptacle for his shame. In secret, he makes love to a body, a person, who he internally looks down on and is disgusted by, because of his own similarity to them. By extension, David is only with Hela in order to satiate his fears about his sexuality. In fact, she's only the second woman David sleeps with or involves himself with in this book, purely due to his own selfish inability to be honest with himself, and thus the people around him who depend on that honesty. Interestingly, Hela herself is not free from the cycle of compulsory heterosexuality. Late in the story, she explains openly to David that she needs to marry him for the same reason he needs to marry her, although she doesn't know that yet. Hela is afraid of not being a woman if she fails to follow the normal life path of heterosexual women. Honestly, Adrienne Rich was really writing for and about women like her. Hela, like David, feels that if she does not comply with what heterosexual society says the track of her life must be, it will destroy her. It will destroy her sense of self and her attachment to her gender. Hela cannot feel like a woman, and thus cannot feel like a person if she doesn't do the straight thing, and she admits openly what many straight people can't.
But what I mean about being a woman is, we might get married now and stay married for 50 years, and I might be a stranger to you every instant of that time, and you might never know it. But if I were a stranger, you would know it. For a woman, she said, I think a man is always a stranger, and there's something awful about being at the mercy of a stranger. But men are at the mercy of women too. Have you never thought of that? Ah, she said, men may be at the mercy of women. I think men like that idea. It strokes the misogynist in them. But if a particular man is ever at the mercy of a particular woman, why, he somehow stopped being a man. And the lady, then, is more neatly trapped than ever. You mean I can't be at your mercy, but you can be at mine? I laughed. I'd like to see you at anyone's mercy, Hela. You may laugh, she said humorously, but there is something in what I say. I began to realize it in Spain, that I wasn't free, that I couldn't be free until I was attached, no, committed to someone. To someone, not something? She was silent. I don't know, she said at last, but I'm beginning to think that women get attached to something really by default. They'd give it up if they could any time for a man. Of course they can't admit this, and neither can most of them let go of what they have, but I think it kills them. Perhaps I only mean, she added after a moment, that it would have killed me. What do you want, Hela? What have you got now that makes such a difference? She laughed. It isn't what I've got. It isn't even what I want. It's that you've got me. So now I can be your obedient and most loving servant. I felt cold. I shook my head in mock confusion. I don't know what you're talking about. Why, she said, I'm talking about my life. I've got you to take care of and feed and torment and trick and love. I've got you to put up with. From now on, I can have a wonderful time complaining about being a woman, but I won't be terrified that I'm not one. She looked at my face and laughed. Oh, I'll be doing other things, she cried. I won't stop being intelligent. I'll read and argue and think and all that, and I'll make a great point of not thinking your thoughts, and you'll be pleased, because I'm sure the resulting confusion will cause you to see that I've only got a finite woman's mind after all, and if God is good, you'll love me more and more and will be quite happy. She laughed again. Don't bother your head about it, sweetheart. Leave it to me. Her amusement was contagious, and I shook my head, again laughing with her. You're adorable, I said. I don't understand you at all. She laughed again. There, she said, that's fine. We're both taking to it like ducks to water.
Hela, like David, cannot handle the threat of her gender being dismantled, and cannot unmoor her femininity from male validation. As Adrienne Rich explains, Hela is perfectly happy acting out the motions of a mostly, if not entirely, loveless straight marriage, merely so that she can affirm that she is in fact a woman, and thus is in fact a person. Her self-actualization is entirely dependent on this. Hela, like David, cannot sit in the space of being unmoored from traditional cis-heteropatriarchal gendered existence, unmoored from time itself. She cannot stand to exist in what to her must feel like a void, a chasm. Neither Hela nor David has the ability to turn away from that which they attempt to be because it's what society enforces, and define their existence on their own terms. In Black Skin, White Masks, post-colonial philosopher Frantz Fanon discusses this phenomenon in the context of race and gives it a name, the zone of non-being. In this psychological state, the oppressed subject lacks the ability to turn away from that which oppresses them and define their own self, and instead turns toward the oppressor, their hope being that by embodying the manner of the oppressor, their nature, they could escape the state of being oppressed. The subject immerses themselves in the mannerisms, the culture, the language, and the very spirit of those who oppress them, denying their self in favor of another. This is essentially what Chiron is doing in the final act of Moonlight as well. He is occupying the zone of non-being intentionally, not accepting his queerness but suppressing and hiding it, and acting straight in order to escape homophobia.
I had rationalized the world, and the world had rejected me in the name of color prejudice. Since there was no way we could agree on the basis of reason, I resorted to irrationality. It was up to the white man to become more irrational than I. For the sake of the cause, I had adopted the process of regression, but the fact remains that it was an unfamiliar weapon. Here I am at home. I am made of the irrational. I wade in the irrational. Rational up to my neck.
The response Fanon encourages is to embrace one's separation from the oppressor's standard mode of being, and radically define oneself. In the anti-colonial context and anti-racist context, he's talking about anti-colonial struggle and about rejecting white supremacy for revolutionary anti-colonial nationalism. In the context of queerness, his philosophy allows us to reject our compulsion towards cis-heterosexual modes of being, and embrace non-normativity, embrace our irrational ways of being, our queerness, our transness. In a sense, Giovanni's Room is about the way that love destroys, how it breaks down societal barriers, and how one struggles not to drown, unmoored by convention. David attempts to lie to everyone, including himself, about what he feels. His inability to step into the world of alternative possibilities with the man he loves destroys his relationships. His fear and resentment of himself builds into resentment for Giovanni. The themes of duality, bisexuality, and two-mindedness are apparent in how Baldwin writes David's thoughts and experiences. He's at once fascinated by Giovanni, in love with him, desiring to kiss him, and also hating him, disgusted by him, overcome with an urge to be violent to him. He at once feels nothing for him, yet everything. His hatred of Giovanni is purely a reaction to his attraction, to his love. One Giovanni sees through, even as David is leaving him to be with Hela.
"You're not leaving me for her," he said. "You're leaving me for some other reason. You lie so much. You've come to believe all your own lies, but I have senses. You're not leaving me for a woman. If you're really in love with this little girl, you would not have had to be so cruel to me." "She's not a little girl," I said. "She's a woman, and no matter what you think, I do love her." "You do not," cried Giovanni, sitting up, "love anyone. You never have loved anyone. I am sure you never will. You love your purity. You love your mirror. You're just like a little virgin. You walk around with your hands in front of you as though you had some precious metal, gold, silver, rubies, maybe diamonds down there between your legs. You will never give it to anybody. You'll never let anybody touch it, man or woman. You want to be clean? You think you came here covered with soap, and you think you'll go out covered with soap? And you do not want to stink. Not even for 5 minutes in the meantime."
He grasped me by the collar, wrestling and caressing at once. Fluid and iron at once. Saliva spraying from his lips and his eyes full of tears, but with the bones of his face showing and the muscles leaping in his arms and neck. You want to leave Giovanni because he makes you stink. You want to despise Giovanni because he's not afraid of the stink of love. You want to kill him in the name of all your lying little moralities, and you are immoral. You were by far the most immoral man I have met in all my life. Look what you've done to me. Do you think you could have done this if I did not love you? Is this what you should do? To love?
Giovanni's Room is one of my favorite books of all time, as Moonlight is one of my favorite films. I grew up in an era where representation for queer people of color was rare, and even now, still can be. Nothing I could find really represented my experience, so Moonlight was a film that always held a lot of significance to me. Likewise, Giovanni's Room holds a similar spot, but is also just one of the best queer stories I've had the pleasure of experiencing. In comparing the two, I find a lot of interest in the way that, despite the two narratives being separated by time, the emotional struggles of the characters are virtually unchanged. The same social pressures dictate their movements, shift their hearts and manners like the moon shifts the tide. In comparing them, we gain a view of two sides of a connected story. Through David, we see the view of someone rejecting themselves and their desires. And through Chiron, we see the subject who is rejected and its growth. Joey and Chiron share great similarity as characters, as does Kevin and David. I don't know how much James Baldwin's work influenced Barry Jenkins and Terrell McCraney, but the emotional connections between their stories, I think, would be almost inevitable regardless. These stories, for me, serve as both reassurance and warning of what it can mean to reject the person you are in favor of a performance, and what it can mean to gain that love for oneself, to gain acceptance of what queer love and solidarity can be when allowed to grow. I won't pretend I personally have overcome all of my feelings of shame and frustration, but I think it gets easier every day. Homophobia is not natural. Transphobia is not natural. Racism is not natural. These systems of control exist to force us into shapes whatever God that created us did not intend, and we have no obligation to submit to the hateful whims of a sick society. Thank you for watching this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it. If you would like to support me as I make more content like this, you can go on Patreon and support me directly via the different tiers there. You get access to things like behind the scenes content, early access to videos that are unreleased on the channel, scripts, writings that don't get turned into actual fully fledged videos, their short stories, whatever. So check that out if you want to support this channel directly. There are a lot of times where Patreon has been the only stable source of income that I have, so I really want to say thank you to everyone supporting the channel that way. Do me a favor and like and subscribe to this video, and especially if you don't mind, take the time to share this with a friend. Share it on whatever social media websites you use or whatever communities it's appropriate in, or whoever you think it would be useful for. And thank you. Have a good one.